All right, so we have a lot to cover in this lesson. We're gonna go over some of the helpers and forces that you can use, and we're gonna create this path follow effect in the process, including mixing different colors of smoke together. So I'm in Max and I'm in Customize Unit Setup. I'm working in display unit centimeters with one unit is 10 centimeters. So first let's create our 3 emitters, which we're gonna emit the 3 colors from. So I'm just gonna create a cylinder and make it an editable poly. And we only wanna emit the smoke from the top polygon. So I'm gonna set the ID to 10. And maybe we can hit R and just make it a little bit smaller. And I'm gonna copy this once and one more time. And maybe align them something like this. Now we need to create a source, so I'm just gonna click on the shortcut here to create fire and smoke source. Let's pick the first cylinder. I'm gonna give it an outgoing velocity of 300 centimeters. We don't want any temperature because we just want the smoke to be following the spline and not really rise up or anything like that. And let's enable RGB, and we can make it maybe like a very light gray, almost white for the first one. And for the polygon ID, let's set that to 10. So the way this works is if you want 3 different colors of smoke, you need 3 different sources. Because as you can see, you can really only pick one color for the RGB for one source. Now you can add a map in here, but in our case, we're just gonna copy this source 2 times. And for the second source, I'm just gonna pick the second cylinder and change the color to maybe a dark gray. And then for the third source, I'm gonna pick the third cylinder and change the RGB to maybe that orange like I did in my example. So now we need a spline for the smoke to follow. So I was just going to create splines and create a helix and just drag that out like this. And the bottom of it is the beginning of the spline and the top of it is the end of the spline. This is important because if you rotate it the wrong way around, the smoke will still be attracted to the beginning of the spline, and then you will wonder why the smoke is going up and around instead of to the beginning of the spline. So we actually need to rotate it this way, 180, and put the beginning of it right where our sources are. So maybe something like right here should work. So this should be good, and I just changed the color so we can see it better. You can do that over here. One more turn just to make it more interesting, or 1.4 for the turns, something like this. And now we need to create a grid. So Phoenix Fire and Smoke Sim grid like this, and make sure that you cover the entire area. And we're gonna leave most of the settings at default because we're pretty much just going for this abstract smoke effect. I would go under dynamics. We don't really need to change anything over here. Maybe we can give it a quality of 16 for the conservation just to get some nice detail in these swirls of the smoke. And then as always, under output, you can output velocity for motion blur and select where you're gonna save it to. And since we want to do color mixing of the smoke, make sure that you check RGB under output, super important. So before we move any further, I just want to always run the simulation really quick just to make sure that I am getting some smoke and that everything is working. It is, so we have 3 different colors of the smoke. You can go under preview and as always enable the RGB preview. But as you can see, as soon as you enable the RGB preview, the colors disappear. And that's because we need to go under the rendering, volumetric options, smoke color. And right now the smoke color is set to constant, so we need to change that to RGB. And now we're getting color in the smoke. And we can go under smoke opacity and maybe raise the opacity to something like 0.8 just to make it a little bit richer. And we can continue the setup from here knowing that everything will work. So now I would just go under helpers, Phoenix FD, and add a follow path helper. And for the spline, let's select the helix. So let me lower the resolution a bit more just so that it's faster as we sort of experiment with this. So let me stop the simulation and maybe only give us like 1.5 million total cells. Go back to path follow and let's just run the simulation and see what it looks like with the default settings. Alright, so the default settings are actually giving us almost the final effect that I had. It's just a bit too fast and crazy. I ended up going for something more slow and elegant just to get this nice sort of rotating action going on. Follow speed is basically how fast the smoke will travel along the spline. The pull speed is the speed at which the smoke is attracted from its source to the splines. And then rotation speed is very nice. That will control the rotation of the smoke along its own axis. So that's what's actually giving us this nice swirl effect where it's rotating along the spline. I'm gonna do 600 for follow speed, 500 for pull speed, 200 for rotation speed. Now influence is an interesting parameter. Basically the smoke right now has two speeds which are fighting against each other. You have the speed of the smoke, which is given to it by this outgoing velocity, and then you have the speed that is given to it by this path follow force. So the smoke is being affected by the follow speed, pull speed, and rotation speed, and by the outgoing velocity speed. And to control which speed basically is dominant over the other, you would control it with the influence. So influence 1 means that the smoke is completely controlled by the path follow speeds and forces. So just to demonstrate how that works, I just set the influence to 0 and I'm running the sim. Alright, 60 frames in, and you can see that at influence 0, the smoke is not being influenced by the path follow force whatsoever. Now let me set that to 1 and see how it will sort of rapidly get attracted to the spline all at once and continue on its merry way forward. So this is an interesting parameter to play with because sometimes you want the smoke to have a little bit of freedom to sort of float around, and maybe some of that smoke gets left behind, creating this nice effect. But sometimes you really want all of that smoke to just stick to the spline very firmly, basically. So maybe you want something more like this, where it looks more like a solid snake rather than having a lot of this extra detail, in which case you would set the influence to 1. One more setting I want to touch on is the pipe radius, which basically controls the thickness of the overall tube in which the smoke lives. So basically, if I am to select the helix and go under rendering, you can say enable in viewport, and you can play with the thickness of this. So basically a pipe radius of 50 centimeters means a thickness of 100 centimeters for this spline. So that's how you can see basically the thickness that the smoke is going to take. So if I were to make this 200 centimeters, you would see that I get a much thicker pipe, and I would need to raise this to 100 to get the smoke to take on this amount of thickness. All right, so I'm running the simulation for our final effect, and I like the way this is looking. I would probably increase the pull speed even more to maybe 1000 centimeters just to get some of this smoke on the edges to stick to the spline even more. If you'd like to see my exact settings that I used to get this example here, feel free to open the project file, look at my settings and use this for any kind of a project that you would like. I just wanted you to understand how all of this works, and we're gonna go over more of these helpers in the next lesson.